Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
The May evening descended upon Hogwarts quietly, almost imperceptibly, as though nature itself was holding its breath before the storm. Professor Pomona Sprout stood in Greenhouse 3, her hands covered in soil up to the wrists, carefully loosening the earth around a young Mimbulus Mimbletonia shoot. The scent of damp earth, compost, and magical plants filled the space. It was the smell of life, growth, hope. The smell that had kept her afloat throughout this terrible year. She could not help but notice how the castle had changed over recent months. How the corridors had withered under the rule of Amicus and Electo Caro. How the light had dimmed in the students' eyes. How even the walls seemed to maintain an ashamed silence, as though embarrassed by what was happening within their bounds. But the greenhouses, the greenhouses had become her last refuge. Here, among leaves and roots, among the whispers of plants and the fragrance of life, she could still breathe freely. Sprout carefully adjusted her worn, patched hat, a faithful companion of so many years, and moved to the next pot. A venomous tentacula coiled in its spacious container, its tendrils lazily stretching toward the light of the magical lanterns that illuminated the greenhouse with a soft, golden glow. The professor knew every plant here, as she would know her own children. She remembered when she had planted each seed, how she had tended each sprout, how she had rejoiced at each new leaf. "Hush now, my beauty," she whispered, pushing aside one of the tendrils that was attempting to wrap around her wrist. "Not today. Today we must all be careful." The tendril reluctantly withdrew, and Sprout couldn't help but smile. Even the most dangerous plants recognized her touch, her voice. She had given them years of her life, and they responded with trust, insofar as a plant created by nature for defense and attack could trust. The greenhouse door creaked quietly, and Sprout turned. Standing in the doorway was Neville Longbottom, his face pale in the soft light, his eyes bearing the weariness that no 17-year-old boy should know. The weariness of someone who had seen too much, endured too much. "Professor Sprout," he said quietly, his voice trembling like the leaves of the whomping willow in the wind. "I need more essence of Didney." Seamus again. The Caros were particularly cruel today. Pomona's heart contracted painfully. She nodded, wiping her hands on her tattered apron, and approached the shelf where she kept the most precious extracts. Her fingers found a small vial of silvery liquid with certainty. Didney, the most powerful healing potion that nature could provide. She had used it more frequently this year than in all her previous decades of teaching. "Here," she said, passing the vial to Neville. Their eyes met, and in the silence that spread between them, more was said than any words could convey. "Be careful, and tell the others, tell them I'm always here. Always." Neville gripped the vial tightly and nodded. His eyes glistened with moisture, but he didn't allow the tears to fall. "Thank you, Professor," he whispered. You can't imagine how much this means. To all of us." When he left, Sprout sank onto the wooden bench that stood by the greenhouse window. Her knees suddenly felt weak, and a heavy, burning ache spread through her chest. She was not a fighter. She never had been. She was a gardener, a teacher, a guardian of life. Not a warrior. But this year had made warriors of them all. She remembered September, when Snape had come to the castle as headmaster, and the Caros as his faithful hounds. She remembered the first staff meeting, where Amicus had announced the new rules with a self-satisfied smile. Punishments, torture, dark magic, taught as the norm. Sprout had sat at the table then, squeezing her hands beneath it so tightly that her nails dug into her palms, but keeping her face calm. She had learned this during the First War. Learned to bury her anger deep, like a seed waiting for spring to sprout. Minerva had sat beside her, solid as stone, but Pomona could see how her jaw trembled. Phileas across the table stared out the window, refusing to meet Snape's eyes. And Horace Slughorn seemed smaller somehow, diminished, as though part of his soul had been taken along with their freedom. But the meeting wasn't the worst of it. The worst were the days after, when students began appearing at lessons with bruises, with cuts, with eyes in which the light was fading. When she heard the first scream from the dungeons, where Amicus had set up his torture chambers. When Electo began teaching Muggle studies as propaganda of hatred, Sprout did what she could. She opened the greenhouses to students seeking refuge. She gave them tasks caring for plants, tasks that were really just excuses, so they could escape the castle's horrors for at least an hour. She brewed medicines, prepared salves, collected essences, Dittany for wounds, bezoars for poisons, nettle leaves for calming drafts. Her small room in the Hufflepuff basement had become like an apothecary. Students came at night, knocking quietly on the door. She didn't ask names, didn't ask for details. She simply healed, simply embraced, simply whispered words of support that were all she could give. "You're stronger than you think," she would tell them. "Roots don't need light to grow. They grow in darkness, deep underground, and that's what makes them strong. You are the roots of Hogwarts. You'll hold it together until spring comes." And they believed. Oh, how they believed. She saw it in their eyes, in their straightened shoulders when they left her. She gave them something more than medicine. She gave them hope. But how much longer could she manage? How much longer would this dark winter last? Sprout rose from the bench and approached the window. From here, from Greenhouse 3 perched on the hillside, there was a view of the forbidden forest. The dark mass of trees lay on the horizon, restless and threatening. The sky above them was heavy, clouded, full of foreboding. She knew that there, in the forest, someone was waiting. Something was waiting. Darkness that was gathering to consume them all. Suddenly the greenhouse door burst open, and Hannah Abbott appeared in the doorway. Her usually pink cheeks were pale, and in her eyes burned a strange, almost feverish fire. "Professor," she exclaimed, breathless. "Professor Sprout, have you heard? Harry Potter. He's in the castle. He's returned." Time seemed to stop. Sprout felt something in her chest both break and rise at once. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the boy upon whom the hopes of the entire magical world rested. He had returned. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice sounding stronger than she expected. "In Ravenclaw Tower, they say, or the Room of Requirement. No one knows for certain. But Professor McGonagall already knows. And Snape knows too," Hannah swallowed. "They say there's going to be a meeting. In the Great Hall." Sprout removed her apron, hung it on the usual hook, and adjusted her hat. Her hands weren't trembling. They had no right to tremble. "Not now. Go, Hannah," she said quietly. "Go to your housemates. Stay together. Whatever happens, stay together. That's most important. Understand?" Hannah nodded, tears shining in her eyes, but she smiled. She smiled as genuinely as one could smile in the midst of war. "Yes, Professor. We'll stay together. All the Hufflepuffs. We won't let you down." When the girl ran off, Sprout stood for another moment in the greenhouse, surveying her plants. Each was a part of her. Each was the result of years of work, care, love. She had grown them to teach, to impart knowledge, to show the beauty of nature and magic woven together. And now, perhaps, she would have to use them for war. The thought was painful, almost unbearable. But if the choice stood between protecting her students and keeping her greenhouses intact, there was no choice. There never had been. Sprout left the greenhouse, closing the door behind her. The cold evening wind tugged at the hem of her tattered robes, but she paid it no mind. Her short legs carried her swiftly along the path leading to the castle. The lights in the windows burned brighter than usual. There was a bustle, a movement pulsing through the stone walls. When she entered the castle through the side door near the kitchens, the first thing that caught her eye was a group of students running down the corridor. Second years, maybe third years. Their faces were frightened, yet excited. "Professor Sprout," called out one of the boys, a Hufflepuff she recognized as Devin Thompson. "Are you going to the Great Hall?" Snape's called everyone. "Everyone." "I am," she replied briefly. "And you, Devin, go to your common room. If something happens there, if something bad starts, hide. Do you hear me? Hide and don't stick your neck out." The boy shook his head in refusal. "No, Professor. If something bad starts, I'll fight. We'll all fight. Enough hiding." In his eyes burned a fire that Sprout hadn't seen all year. The fire of resistance. The fire of courage. And she suddenly understood that her students were no longer children. This year had taken their childhood and given them something else instead. Something hard and sharp, like rose thorns. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and hurried on. The great hall was packed. All 4 houses had gathered at their tables, but the atmosphere was nothing like regular dinners. Tension hung in the air, thick and heavy. Students whispered, looked around, their faces pale in the light of floating candles. Sprout saw Minerva by the staff table. Professor McGonagall stood straight, her thin face stern, and in her eyes burned the anger that Pomona knew well. Beside her stood Phileas Flitwick, small and somewhat crumpled, but his wand was already in hand. Horace Slughorn sat at the table, his plump hands gripping its edge. And on the platform, in the place belonging to the headmaster, stood Severus Snape. Pomona Sprout had never liked Snape. Not when he was a student, a sharp, cruel boy who bullied others. Not when he became a professor, a cold, sarcastic man who intimidated students. And certainly not now, when he had betrayed everything she believed in. She approached her place by the staff table, but didn't sit. She stood beside Minerva, feeling their shoulders barely touch. A small gesture of solidarity, but they both felt it. Snape raised his hand, and the hall fell silent. His black eyes slid over the students' faces, cold and assessing. "I have been informed," he began, his voice quiet but audible in every corner of the hall, "that this evening someone saw Harry Potter on the castle grounds." A wave of whispers rolled through the hall. Snape waited, allowing it to subside. "If any of you has information about Potter's whereabouts, you must immediately inform me or one of the staff. Anyone who attempts to help this boy will be punished. Anyone who has information and doesn't share it will be punished. Is that clear to everyone?" Silence. Heavy, pregnant silence, full of defiance. And then suddenly, from the back of the hall, from the Ravenclaw table, a figure rose. Sprout recognized her immediately, Luna Lovegood, the girl with dreamy eyes and unbreakable faith in goodness. "Respectfully, sir, but if Harry Potter has returned, then perhaps there's a reason for it," she said in her quiet, melodious voice. "Perhaps he knows something we don't. Perhaps he's come to make something right." Snape whirled toward her, his robes billowing behind him. "Sit down, Miss Lovegood," he hissed through his teeth. "You have no right." "She has the right." Minerva McGonagall's voice rang out clearly and authoritatively. She stepped forward, and Sprout saw her figure tense. "She has the right to speak, just as we all have the right to know the truth. Severus, what's happening? Why are you so afraid of Harry Potter's return?" Snape's face became stony. "I'm not afraid, Minerva. I'm simply doing my duty. Potter is wanted." "You know who is searching for him," Minerva interrupted, and for the first time all year she spoke those words aloud. "But that doesn't mean we must help him." Snape descended from the platform, his movements slow, like a predator preparing to strike. "I'm warning you, Professor McGonagall, don't cross the line. And I'm warning you," Minerva's voice became even firmer, "that this castle doesn't belong to you. It belongs to all of us. The students, the staff, everyone who loves Hogwarts. And if Harry Potter has returned to fight for it, then I stand with him." The great hall erupted. Students jumped to their feet, their voices merging into a chorus of support. Sprout felt her own heart beat faster, felt blood quicken its pace through her veins. This was the moment when everything changed. Snape drew his wand, but Minerva was faster. Red light flashed in the air, and Severus barely managed to raise a shield. The spell ricocheted, struck the wall, leaving a black mark on the stone. "Minerva!" Sprout called out, but McGonagall was already attacking again. Phileas joined her, his wand moving so fast it drew light arcs in the air. Sprout didn't hesitate. She drew her wand, old, thickened rosewood that had served her faithfully for over 40 years, and added her voice to the duel. "Stupefy!" she exclaimed, and a red beam flew towards Snape. He dodged, his robes billowing like the wings of a great black bird. His wand moved with such speed that Sprout could barely track it. He raised shields, deflected attacks, counterattacked. She saw mastery in his every movement, years of experience and skill, but she also saw that he wasn't aiming to kill. He was simply defending himself. "Expelliarmus!" Minerva cried out, and Snape's wand nearly flew from his hand. He gripped it tighter, turned, and vanished. He didn't apparate. Apparition within Hogwarts was impossible. He transformed into a stream of black smoke and flew through the window, shattering the glass into tiny shards. Cold night wind struck the hall, extinguishing some of the candles. Sprout stood, breathing heavily, her wand still extended. Her heart was pounding so hard it seemed ready to leap from her chest. She couldn't believe what had just happened. She, Pomona Sprout, peaceful gardener, had just dueled the headmaster of Hogwarts. But the most amazing thing wasn't the duel itself. The most amazing thing was what the students felt. They were shouting. They were applauding. They were crying with joy. In mere minutes, they had cast off the chains of fear that had held them all year. Minerva turned to the hall, her chest rising and falling from the exertion, but her face glowed with triumph. "Snape is no longer headmaster of this castle," she said loudly. The Carrows no longer have power over you. We are taking back Hogwarts." The ovation was deafening. Sprout felt tears come to her eyes, but she smiled. She smiled as widely as she hadn't smiled in many months. But the smile vanished when the great hall was suddenly filled with a voice. A cold, high voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A voice that made blood freeze in one's veins. "I know you are hiding Harry Potter," said Lord Voldemort's voice, and students gasped, some covering their ears. "You have until midnight. Give me Potter, and I will spare the castle. Give me Potter, and no one else need suffer. If you shield him, if you try to hide him from me, I will destroy everyone in this castle. Every man, woman, and child who stands in my way. Time is passing. Decide." The silence that followed was different. Not the silence of triumph. The silence of horror. Sprout looked at the students' faces and saw fear. Saw doubt. Saw how some of them glanced at one another, as though asking, "Is it worth it? Is one boy's life worth everyone else's?" Minerva stepped onto the platform, her figure looking small and lonely against the backdrop of the enormous hall. "Listen to me," she began, her voice not as commanding as before. It was warm, human, full of understanding. "I won't lie to you. Ahead lies danger. The most terrible danger any of you has ever faced. If you wish to leave, if you're afraid, no one will judge you. Younger students will be evacuated. But if you stay, if you choose to fight..." She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Everyone understood. Sprout took a step forward, her short legs carrying her onto the platform beside Minerva. She looked at the hall, at hundreds of faces looking at her. "I've spent most of my life in this castle," she said, and her voice, though not as strong as Minerva's, carried warmth and sincerity. "I've watched many of you come here as small, frightened 11-year-olds. I've watched you grow, watched you learn, watched you become who you are now. This castle is a home, not just a building, a home. And when your home is attacked, you don't run. You stand. You defend it." She paused, feeling her throat tighten with emotion. "I'm not a warrior," she continued. "I never have been. I'm a gardener. I grow plants. I teach you to care for them. But today I will use everything I know, everything I have, to protect this home. And if you stand with me, if you want to fight, I will be proud of each of you. Whatever the consequences." She stepped back, and for a moment silence reigned in the hall. And then Ernie Macmillan rose, a tall Hufflepuff with a determined expression. "I'm staying," he said loudly. "Me too," added Hannah Abbott, rising beside him. "And I," called a voice from the Gryffindor table. It was Neville Longbottom, and his face was no longer frightened. It was resolved. One by one students rose. Not all. Many younger ones trembled and cried, and Sprout saw Phileas beginning to organize their evacuation. But the older ones, there were many older ones left. Too many. Minerva turned to Sprout, and their eyes met. In that gaze was understanding, fear, determination, all together. "Pomona," McGonagall said quietly, so only the two of them could hear. "We need to prepare. Quickly." Sprout nodded. Her mind was already working, building plans. Greenhouses. Plants. Weapons. "I need students," she said. "Those who know how to handle plants. Especially dangerous ones. Take whoever you need." Minerva squeezed her shoulder firmly. "And Pomona, be careful." Sprout smiled the way only someone who had made their decision and no longer wavered could smile. "Caution is for those who have a choice, Minerva. We don't have one." An hour later, Pomona Sprout stood by the window of her room in the Hufflepuff basement. The great hall had emptied. Students scattered to prepare, professors took up defense, younger ones were being evacuated. She had asked Minerva for a few minutes to collect things from her room. In truth, she needed time to think, to comprehend. She looked out the window at the night landscape. The greenhouses were visible on the hillside, their glass walls dimly shimmering in the moonlight. Beyond them, the forbidden forest, dark and threatening. Somewhere in those dark depths, an army was gathering. An army that wanted to destroy everything she loved. Sprout placed her palm on the cold window glass. Her fingers, always covered in earth, were clean now. She had washed them before going to the Great Hall. She didn't know why. She simply felt it was necessary. And now she looked at them, at these old, calloused hands that had devoted their lives to growing, not destroying. Hands that had tended plants, healed students, created life. And today these same hands would have to create death. The thought was heavy, almost unbearable. But Sprout had long ago learned to live with heavy thoughts. She had survived the First War, had seen friends, colleagues, students fall, had seen how the Dark Lord first tried to destroy their world, and survived, endured. She would endure this time too. Sprout stepped away from the window and approached her small bookshelf. Her fingers slid along the spines, old herbology textbooks, notes about plants, observation journals. All her knowledge, all her life was here, in these books and in the greenhouses beyond the window. She pulled out one book, the oldest, with a worn leather cover. This was a gift from her mentor, Professor Beery, when Pomona was just beginning to teach. It contained records of the most dangerous magical plants, of how they had been used in wars of the past. She had never thought she would need this book. Sprout opened it to the necessary page, on the use of Venomous Tentacula in fortress defense. The text was written in an ancient hand, the ink faded with time, but the words still read clearly. Tentacula are most effective when dropped from height. Their tendrils instinctively seek living bodies, and will not release until they strangle. She closed the book. She didn't want to read further, didn't want to know the details of how her beloved plants killed. But she had to. Sprout took the book under her arm and left the room. The Hufflepuff corridors were empty and quiet. Usually there was always coziness here, warm yellow walls, soft light, the smell of freshly baked rolls from the nearby kitchens. But today even here the tension that permeated the entire castle could be felt. She passed the portrait of the house founder. Helga Hufflepuff looked at her from the canvas, her kind face full of understanding. Sprout stopped for a moment. "Lady Hufflepuff," she whispered to the portrait. "If you see us now, if you understand what's happening, bless us. Give us strength to protect what you created." The portrait didn't answer. It wasn't alive like other portraits in the castle. But Sprout felt something. Warmth. Support. Perhaps it was only her imagination, but she felt better. She hurried on, climbed the stairs, and emerged from the basement. The castle hummed like a disturbed beehive. People were running everywhere, dragging furniture, preparing defensive positions. Professor McGonagall stood in the center of a corridor, giving orders to a group of older students. Professor Flitwick flew past her, his wand already drawing protective runes in the air. "Professor Sprout," Minerva called to her. "Are you ready?" "Ready," Pomona replied, clutching the book under her arm. "I'm going to the greenhouses. I need students." "Take Longbottom," Minerva said, "and those who were in Dumbledore's army. They know how to fight. And your Hufflepuffs." She paused for a moment. "Your Hufflepuffs know how to listen and work together. That's most important." Sprout nodded and was about to leave, but Minerva suddenly grabbed her hand. "Pomona," she said quietly, and in her eyes Sprout saw something unusual. Fear. Minerva McGonagall, the strongest which she knew, was afraid. "Be careful. Please. We can't lose you." Sprout squeezed her hand in response. "I will be Minerva. I promise." She left the castle through the main doors. Cold night air struck her face, and she breathed deeply. It smelled of grass, earth, forest. It smelled of nature, life. It smelled of home. How much longer would she sense these smells? Sprout shook her head, chasing away dark thoughts, and hurried along the path to the greenhouses. The moon lit her way, and stars overhead twinkled with cold, distant light. Somewhere up there, high in the sky, worlds rotated unchangingly, indifferent to what was happening below. To small human wars, to small human fears. But for Pomona Sprout this war wasn't small. This was her war. A war for her home, for her students, for everything she believed in. When she reached Greenhouse 3, she stopped at the threshold. From here, from this spot, there was a view of the forbidden forest. The dark mass of trees lay on the horizon, and Sprout could have sworn she saw movement between the trunks. Shadows that crawled, figures that gathered. "They're coming," she thought. "The army of darkness is coming to Hogwarts." And she would have to stop them, she and her plants. Sprout turned to the greenhouse. Through the glass walls she could see her creations, plants she had grown for years. Mandrakes in large pots, their thick roots resembling human bodies. Venomous Tentacula, whose tendrils coiled lazily in containers. Snargaluff with their pulsating pods. Devil's Snare that whispered in dark corners. They were all part of her. They all trusted her. And today she would betray that trust. She would use them not for life, but for death. "Forgive me," she whispered to the plants, though she knew they didn't understand words. "Forgive me, but there is no other way." She placed her palm on the cold greenhouse glass. Through it she felt the warmth coming from the plants inside. Felt their strength, their life energy. Today this strength would become a weapon. Today nature would fight alongside magic. And perhaps, Just perhaps, together they could protect Hogwarts. Sprout stepped away from the greenhouse and looked toward the castle. Lights in the windows burned brightly, like stars fallen to earth. There, behind those walls, they were preparing for battle. Professors, students, everyone who had chosen to stay and fight. She would not fail them. Pomona Sprout, Professor of Herbology, head of Hufflepuff, gardener and healer, straightened her shoulders. Her short figure seemed small against the backdrop of the enormous castle, but in her eyes burned an unbreakable fire. She knew what she had to do. She knew that the plants she had grown with love and care would become today not just teaching materials. They would become weapons. Living, breathing weapons that could save Hogwarts, or die trying. Sprout turned her face toward the forbidden forest. The darkness there was thickening, approaching. She felt it with her whole being, the approach of something terrible, inevitable. But she wasn't afraid. No, that was a lie. She was afraid, terribly afraid, to the trembling in her knees, to the cold in her stomach. But fear wouldn't stop her, because roots hold the tree even during a storm. Roots are invisible, deep underground, but they give strength. They don't let the tree fall. And today she would be the roots of Hogwarts. Sprout adjusted her worn hat, gripped her wand tightly, and set off back to the castle. She needed to gather students. They needed to work. Because the night was long and time was short. The Battle of Hogwarts was approaching, and Professor Pomona Sprout was ready to meet it. When Pomona Sprout returned to the castle to gather students, the clock on the astronomy tower struck 11. 1 hour until midnight. 1 hour until Voldemort's ultimatum. But she knew they wouldn't give up Harry Potter. None of them would give him up. A group of students was already waiting for her by the main entrance. Ernie Macmillan, Hannah Abbott, Susan Bones, Justin Finch-Fletchley, all her Hufflepuffs loyal to the last. Beside them stood Neville Longbottom, and behind him, Ginny Weasley, Luna Lovegood, Dean Thomas. A few more faces she recognized from herbology lessons. They all held wands in their hands. All looked at her with a mixture of fear and determination. "Professor," said Ernie, stepping forward, "we're ready. What should we do?" Sprout surveyed them. So few, she thought. So few of them, and the enemy an army. But then she remembered the words she had once told them. Roots don't need light to grow. They grow in darkness and become strong. "Come," she said simply, "to the greenhouses. We have much work and little time." They followed her into the night. Cold wind tugged at their robes, and Sprout could hear someone quietly whispering calming words to themselves. She didn't turn around. Everyone fought their fear in their own way. When they reached Greenhouse 3, Sprout opened the door and lit all the lanterns with a wave of her wand. Warm, golden light flooded the space, and the smell of earth and plants enveloped them like a blanket. For a moment, just a brief moment, Sprout allowed herself to feel this coziness. The last time before the storm. "Listen carefully," she began, standing in the center of the greenhouse and looking at the young faces surrounding her. "We're going to collect plants that can serve as weapons. Venomous Tentacula, they can grab and strangle. Mandrakes, their cry stuns. Snargaluff, their pods explode. Devil's Snare, they wrap around and strangle." She saw some faces pale, especially Hannah, who had always been gentle and timid. "I understand this is frightening," Sprout said more softly. "I'm frightened myself. But these plants aren't just weapons. They're defense. Defense for our friends, for our home. We won't attack. We'll defend." "How will we transport them?" asked Susan Bones. "Mandrakes are heavy and tentacula." "Levitation," Sprout replied. "Locomotor for the pots, and for plants that are too dangerous to touch." She thought for a moment. "We'll use protective charms. Protego around the hands will give us protection from poison and thorns." She took out her wand and demonstrated. Speaking Protego, she created a semi-transparent shield around her palms, then carefully extended her hands toward a venomous tentacula. The plant's tendrils tried to wrap around her wrist, but slid across the protective shield, unable to grip. "See," she said, "magic and nature together. This is exactly what I've taught you all these years." The students began dispersing through the greenhouse, drawing wands and approaching the plants. Sprout walked among them, giving instructions, correcting mistakes. "Ernie, not so close to the tentacula. It can break through a weak shield. Strengthen it. Yes, better. Hannah, when lifting a pot with a mandrake, be sure to keep the plant under a sleeping charm. We don't want it waking up here. Neville." She stopped beside the boy who was carefully, almost tenderly, lifting a large pot with a Snargaluff. Neville, you're doing wonderfully. Just wonderfully. He looked at her, and moisture glinted in his eyes. Thank you, Professor. For everything. For always believing in me. I didn't believe without reason, she replied quietly. I saw what others didn't see. I saw your heart, your courage. You'll be an excellent herbologist, Neville. After this night. I promise you. If we survive this night, she added in her thoughts, but not aloud. The work continued quickly but carefully. Pots with plants were carried out of the greenhouse and lined up on the path. Large, heavy mandrakes. Vicious venomous tentacula in iron containers. Snargaluff whose pods were already beginning to pulse, ready to explode. And finally, the most dangerous, Devil's Snare, coiling in wooden crates like living serpents. Sprout stood among this arsenal of living weapons and felt a strange combination of pride and sorrow. Pride that she had grown them so strong, so alive. Sorrow that they would have to use them for death. Professor, came Luna Lovegood's voice. The girl stood at the entrance to Greenhouse 1, her dreamy face serious. What about healing plants? Shouldn't we take something in case of injuries? Sprout stopped. Of course. How could she have forgotten? Luna, you're brilliant, she said sincerely. Ernie, Justin, help me. We need Didney, nettle leaves, valerian root, everything that can help the wounded. They entered Greenhouse 1, where Sprout grew healing plants. It was quieter here, calmer. The smell here was different, not sharp and dangerous, but soft, soothing. The smell of life, not death. Sprout quickly collected what was needed, filling baskets and pouches. Her hands moved confidently, automatically. How many times had she done this in her life? Hundreds. Thousands. But never before had the stakes been so high. Take this to the hospital wing, she ordered Luna and Lavender. Give it to Madame Pomfrey. Tell her it's from me. She'll know what to do with it. The girls nodded and hurried off, carrying the baskets. Sprout returned to the main group. They were finishing loading the last pots. Now in front of the greenhouses stood about 30 plants, a small army but deadly. Good, Sprout said, surveying her work. Now we need to transport them to the castle, to the battlements, where we can use them most effectively. How will we get them past the Carrows? Asked Zacharias Smith, the only one in the group who still looked doubtful. They're still in the castle, aren't they? The Carrows fled with Snape, Neville replied. I saw them running. Cowards. Then there's no time to waste, Sprout said decisively. Locomotor. Her wand flashed, and the first pot with a mandrake smoothly rose into the air. Other students repeated after her, and soon an entire procession of enchanted plants was moving along the path to the castle. They walked silently, only occasionally someone whispered. Sprout walked ahead, her short figure leading this strange procession. The moon lit their way, and stars overhead twinkled with cold light. When they reached the castle, they saw it living a feverish life. Professor Flitwick stood on one of the battlements, calling out spells that created protective barriers around the castle. Professor McGonagall walked the corridors, organizing the defense. Students carried furniture, weapons, everything that could be used for protection. Professor Sprout, Minerva called to her, descending the stairs. You've collected the plants. Excellent. Bring them to the north and east battlements. We're most vulnerable there. Understood, Sprout nodded. And the younger students? Being evacuated through a secret passage to Hogsmeade. Phileas is leading them. The older ones. Minerva paused, and her face momentarily seemed so tired, so old. The older ones have made their choice. We can't forbid them. Sprout nodded, understanding. She too couldn't have forbidden her students to fight for their home. They climbed to the north battlement, a wide stone platform with crenellated parapet that overlooked the hillside slopes and the forbidden forest beyond them. From here there was a panoramic view of the approaches to the castle. Anyone advancing from this direction would be an open target. Sprout placed the first pot with a mandrake by the parapet. Then another. Another. Students helped her, arranging plants along the entire battlement. Venomous Tentacula, Snargaluff, Devil's Snare, all took their positions. When they start advancing, Sprout explained to the students gathered around her, we'll drop the mandrakes first. Their cry should stun the front ranks. Then Snargaluff pods. They'll explode when they hit the ground. And Tentacula and Snare, for those who get too close to the walls. What should we do? Asked Hannah. Just stand and wait? No, Sprout shook her head. You'll help me control the plants. Some of them need constant magical control, especially Devil's Snare. Without it they can break free from control and attack us ourselves. She looked at the students' faces and saw fear, but also saw determination. They were frightened, but they weren't giving up. Weren't running. They stood. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "Each of you. Whatever happens this night, remember, you did what was right. You're defending your home. There's nothing more noble." Ernie Macmillan straightened his shoulders. "We won't let you down, Professor. We promise." Sprout smiled, but the smile vanished when she heard a cry. A cry that sounded from below, from the castle grounds. She ran to the parapet and looked down. What she saw made her blood freeze. Down the hillside slopes, from the direction of the forbidden forest, darkness was moving. Not simply the absence of light, living, pulsating darkness, formed from hundreds, perhaps thousands of figures. Death Eaters in black robes and masks. Giants walking with heavy gait, shaking the earth. Acromantulas, huge spiders crawling with incredible speed. And above it all, in the air, Dementors circled, their ragged figures dark stains against the starry sky. Voldemort's army, the army that had come to destroy Hogwarts. "Oh, Merlin," Susan whispered, her face becoming white as chalk. Sprout felt a chill run down her spine, but forced herself to straighten. She had no right to show fear. Not now. Not when students were looking to her, waiting for instructions. "To positions," she ordered, and her voice sounded firm, despite everything trembling inside her. "Prepare the plants. Wait for my command." Students scattered across the battlement, taking their places by the pots. Sprout stood in the center, her wand extended, eyes fixed on the approaching army. Protective barriers, created by Flitwick and other professors, flashed with golden light as the first Death Eater spells struck them. The earth shuddered from explosions. The air filled with screams, roars, sounds of battle. And then Sprout saw them. Giants heading straight for the north wall. 3 enormous creatures, each as tall as a 3-story building. They dragged huge wooden logs behind them, preparing to ram the walls. "They're coming here," she said loudly. "Get ready." The giants approached, their heavy steps echoing in the night. 100 meters. 80. 60. "Hold," Sprout whispered, more to herself than to the students. "A bit more. Just a bit." 40 meters. 30. 20. "Now," she shouted. "Mandrakes." Students raised wands, and pots with mandrakes flew over the parapet. They fell down, spinning in the air, and when they smashed against the ground right in front of the giants, a cry burst from them. Oh, what a cry it was! Sprout had heard it many times, but never from so many mandrakes at once. It wasn't just a sound. It was physical force, a wave of pure, wild noise that struck everything living around. The giants stopped, clutching their heads. Death Eaters walking behind them fell to the ground, covering their ears with their hands. Even the acromantulas stopped, their huge bodies shuddering from pain. "Snargaluff!" Sprout shouted, not wasting time. "Now!" Snargaluff pods flew after the mandrakes. They were smaller, dark green, pulsating. And when they struck the ground among the enemies, they exploded. Not with fire, not with force, but with thousands of seeds, each covered in the plant's caustic juice. Seeds covered the giant, Death Eaters around him, the ground. And everywhere they landed, it began to smoke and hiss. The giant roared, not from the pain of the mandrakes, but from true agony. His skin covered with burns, clothes began to dissolve. He tried to wipe off the seeds, but they had already eaten deep. Death Eaters, covered in juice, screamed and fell. Their robes smoked. Protective charms couldn't withstand the caustic force of Snargaluff seeds. 2 more! Lavender cried, and 2 more pots flew down. Explosions thundered one after another. Sprout saw the dark army waver, saw front ranks retreat, trying to avoid burns. "We're holding them," Neville shouted, jumping to his feet. "Professor, we're holding them." But Sprout saw otherwise. Saw new waves of Death Eaters emerging from the forest. Saw acromantulas going around the main path, crawling along rocks to the side, where there was no defense from plants. Saw how one of the giants, despite burns, continued forward, dragging the huge log. "They're coming from the flank," someone shouted. "Spiders!" Sprout turned and saw them. Acromantulas crawling up the east wall, their huge bodies easily clinging to the stone masonry. Another minute, and they'd be on the battlement. "Protego tot alum," she shouted, directing her wand to the edge of the battlement. A golden shield flashed, but it was too weak, too small for such a number of enemies. The first acromantula broke through it like a web and climbed onto the battlement. It was enormous, the size of a small house. 8 eyes glittered in the darkness, pincers clicked, dripping with venom. It moved its head, searching for prey, and its gaze stopped on Lavender Brown. The girl screamed, trying to retreat, but stumbled and fell. Stupefy! Sprout shouted, her spell hitting the acromantula in one of its eyes. The spider howled and turned toward her, but then Neville appeared between them. Incendio! He cried, and a stream of fire burst from his wand. The acromantula retreated, but the fire only enraged it. It lunged forward, its pincers opening wide. Neville! Sprout screamed, but the boy didn't retreat. He stood firm, his wand moving so fast it drew fiery arcs in the air. Bombarda! He exclaimed. The explosion hit the acromantula in the head, throwing it back. It tumbled over the parapet, and with a terrible scraping sound fell down. Neville turned to Sprout, breathing heavily. His face was covered in soot, but his eyes burned with triumph. I did it, he whispered. Aye! Look out! Ginny cried. 2 more acromantulas climbed onto the battlement. Behind them, 3 more. They surrounded the students, their pincers clicking in anticipation of prey. Tentacula! Sprout shouted. Neville, Ginny, Tentacula. Now! They rushed to the pots with Venomous Tentacula. Sprout joined them, her wand creating a protective shield around her hands. Locomotor! They shouted together. Pots with Tentacula flew into the air. Sprout directed them not down to the Death Eaters, but straight at the acromantulas on the battlement. The first pot smashed against the back of the nearest spider. The tentacula burst free, its tendrils immediately wrapping around the spider's body. The acromantula shrieked, trying to shake off the plant, but the tentacula had already found its vulnerable spots, joints between body segments, soft tissues around the eyes. The second and third pots hit other spiders. Soon the battlement turned into a battlefield between plants and monsters. Tentacula strangled, acromantulas bit and clawed, green blood mixed with plant sap. Retreat! Sprout ordered the students. Away from them. They retreated to the center of the battlement, staying together. Sprout stood before them, her wand extended, ready to defend. One of the acromantulas, having torn off the tentacula, turned toward them. It was wounded, green blood flowing from a dozen wounds, but still dangerous. It raised its front legs, preparing to jump. Sprout didn't hesitate. Defindo! She shouted, and the severing charm cut through the spider's 2 front legs. The acromantula fell, its body collapsing onto the stone. Sprout approached closer, and finished it with another stupefy. Silence. For a moment, just a brief moment, silence reigned on the battlement. Students looked at her with a mixture of wonder and fear. She, Professor Sprout, peaceful gardener, had just killed an acromantula. Professor, Hannah whispered, you. I did what I had to, Sprout replied, her voice firm though her hands trembled. Just as you will, if you must. This is war. We're defending ourselves. But suddenly she heard a cry, a real, human cry of pain. She turned and saw Dean Thomas. He lay by the parapet, his leg covered in blood. A spell, red, hot, had hit him when he was distracted by the spiders. Dean! Sprout rushed to him. The boy clutched his leg, his face contorted with pain. Blood flowed between his fingers, dark and too profuse. Don't move, Sprout ordered, dropping to her knees beside him. Don't move. Her hands automatically went to her pockets, pulling out a vial of Didney. She poured the essence onto the wound, and Dean screamed even louder. Didney burned as it healed. Hold on, she whispered. Just hold on. But even as she treated Dean, from the corner of her eye she saw that below the army was preparing for a new attack. Even more Death Eaters, even more monsters. And one of the giants, the one dragging the log, was already at the foot of the wall. Professor, Neville whispered, approaching her. The giant. He's. I see, she replied, not looking away from Dean. The giant raised the log. He was aiming at the wall, preparing to deliver a blow that could shatter stone. If he struck, the wall might fall. And behind it, the castle. Students. Everyone she loved. A choice. She had to make a choice. Treat Dean, or stop the giant. She couldn't do both. Sprout looked at Hannah. Take the Didney, she said, passing the vial to the girl. Continue treating him. Pour evenly, not too much at once. Understand? Yes, but... Professor, what are you? I'm doing what I must, Sprout replied, rising. She approached the last crates, those containing Devil's Snare. The most dangerous plants of all she had. Plants that didn't just grab. They didn't let go until their victims stopped breathing. Neville, Ginny, she called. I need your help. They approached, their faces serious. We'll take the Devil's Snare, Sprout said, and drop it on the giant. But it will be dangerous. The snare can break free from control. If that happens... We're risking, Neville interrupted. We understand. But there's no choice, is there? Sprout looked at him and saw in his eyes the same determination she felt herself. Yes, she confirmed. There's no choice. They opened the crates. Devil's Snare burst free, its long, sticky tendrils reaching in all directions. Sprout felt them trying to grab her, but her protective shield held. Protego, she shouted, strengthening the protection. Neville, Ginny, do the same. They created protective shields, and together lifted the Devil's Snare, using magic. The plants resisted. They wanted to strangle, to grab, but the three wizards were stronger. To the edge, Sprout ordered. Slowly, they carried the snare to the parapet. Below, the giant raised the log above his head, preparing to strike. One more second, and it would be too late. Now, Sprout screamed. Drop it! They released the Devil's Snare. The plants flew down, their tendrils opening wide, like the wings of some terrible bird. They fell on the giant, on his head, shoulders, back, and immediately began wrapping around. Tendrils, each as thick as a human arm, coiled around the giant's neck, his arms, his body. They reached for his mouth, nose, eyes. The giant screamed, low, terribly, a sound that made blood freeze in veins. He dropped the log, which fell with a crash to the ground. His huge hands grabbed at the tendrils, trying to tear them off, but Devil's Snare never let go. Never. The giant swayed, took a step back, then another. His movements became slower, clumsier. He was falling to his knees, still trying to fight, but the snare strangled him, didn't let go. And then he fell. The impact was so strong that Sprout felt the battlement shudder beneath her feet. The giant didn't move anymore. Silence again descended on the battlement. Students looked down at the body of the enormous creature, covered in green tendrils of Devil's Snare. No one spoke. There were no words for what they had just witnessed. Sprout turned. Her students looked at her, some with wonder, some with fear. She saw how they looked at her hands, at her wand, as though not recognizing her. And she understood them. She didn't recognize herself either. The first wave is repelled, she said quietly. But this is only the beginning. They'll return, and we need to be ready. Neville approached her, his face serious. Professor, he said, you saved us. Saved the castle. Sprout shook her head. No, Neville. We saved. Together. Not me alone. All of us. She turned to the battlement, looking at the battlefield below. Bodies of acromantulas, the giant Death Eaters. Her plants, scattered among them, Mandrakes that no longer cried, Tentacula that still coiled, Devil's Snare that crawled across the ground. Such a price. Such a terrible price. But the castle stood. Students lived. And she would continue to fight as long as she had strength. How's Dean? She asked, turning to Hannah. The bleeding stopped, the girl replied, her voice trembling. He'll survive. Good, Sprout nodded. Take him to the hospital wing. Ernie, Justin, help. The rest with me. We need to prepare for the next attack. She looked east. The sky was beginning to lighten. The first rays of dawn touched the horizon. How much time had passed? An hour? 2. It seemed like an eternity. But the night wasn't over yet. The battle wasn't over yet. And Professor Pomona Sprout, gardener turned warrior, stood on the battlement of her castle, ready to meet what dawn would bring. The first spells flew at them before Sprout could even exhale. Red light, green, blue. Dozens of beams shot up from the Death Eaters below and struck the stone parapet, leaving black scorch marks and deep furrows. Heads down, she shouted, grabbing Hannah by the shoulder and pressing her to the floor. Students dropped behind the parapet, huddling against the cold stone. Sprout felt a spell fly over her head, so close she felt its heat. Professor, Ernie cried. What do we do? Sprout rose to her knees, peering through the parapet crenellations. Voldemort's army was already on the hillside, Death Eaters in black robes racing upward, crying out curses. Behind them, 3 giants, their heavy steps leaving deep tracks in the earth. Acromantulas crawled along the sides, their many legs moving with terrifying speed. 1 more minute, perhaps 2, and they'd be at the walls. Mandrakes, Sprout shouted, turning to the students. Ernie, Justin, Dean, prepare them. Now. The 3 boys crawled to the pots with Mandrakes. Their hands trembled as they drew their wands. Remember, Sprout said quickly, remove the sleeping charm only when they're already flying. Not before. And immediately cover your ears. Understood. Ernie raised his wand. Locomotor. The first pot rose into the air. After it, a second, third. They floated to the edge of the battlement, swaying unsteadily. Sprout peered out again. The Death Eaters were already 70 meters away. 60. 50. Hold, she whispered. A bit more, just a bit. 40 meters. 30. She could see their masks, could see them raising wands for a new volley of spells. Now, she screamed. Drop them, and remove the charms. Ernie jerked his wand sharply. The pot flew over the parapet and began to fall. In the same instant he spoke. Finite incantatem. Sprout covered her ears with her hands and shouted to the others. Cover your ears. Every one. The pot smashed against the ground right in front of the first ranks of Death Eaters. A cry burst from it. Oh, Merlin. It wasn't just a sound. It was a wall of solid noise that struck everything living. The Mandrakes screamed, high, piercing, with such force that Sprout felt the stone vibrate beneath her feet. Even through covered ears the sound was almost unbearable. And below the Death Eaters fell. They clutched their heads, screamed, rolled on the ground. Some lost consciousness immediately. Others tried to crawl away, but their movements were clumsy, disoriented. More! Sprout shouted, though she could barely hear her own voice through the ringing in her ears. More Mandrakes. Justin and Dean dropped their pots. 2 more cries joined the first, creating a cacophony that seemed to crack the very air. Even more Death Eaters fell. Even the giants stopped, roaring in pain and clutching their enormous heads. It's working, Ginny Weasley cried, her face glowing with triumph. It's working. But Sprout saw that some Death Eaters, the most experienced, were placing protective charms around their ears. They continued advancing, slower, but advancing. And when the Mandrakes' cries began to weaken, the plants were exhausting themselves. They accelerated again. Snargaluff, Sprout ordered. Hannah, Susan Lavender, your turn. The girls crawled to the pots with Snargaluff. The plant's pods pulsated, ready to explode at the slightest impact. Sprout saw fear in Hannah's eyes, saw how her hands trembled. You can do this, she said, placing her palm on the girl's shoulder. I know you can. Hannah breathed deeply and nodded, then raised her wand. Locomotor. Pots with Snargaluff rose into the air. They were heavier than Mandrakes, moved more slowly, but the girls controlled them confidently. At the giants. Sprout pointed. Aim for the giants. The pots flew over the parapet. They fell, gaining speed, and Sprout held her breath, waiting for impact. The first pot hit the giant in the chest. Snargaluff pods exploded. It was like the explosion of 1,000 small firecrackers at once. Seeds scattered in all directions, each covered in the plant's caustic juice. It covered the giant, Death Eaters around him, the ground. And everywhere it landed, it began to smoke and hiss. The giant roared, not from Mandrake pain, but from true agony. His skin covered with burns, clothes began to dissolve. He tried to wipe off the seeds, but they had already eaten deep. Death Eaters, covered in juice, screamed and fell. Their robes smoked. Protective charms couldn't withstand the caustic force of Snargaluff seeds. 2 more. Susan cried, and 2 more pots flew down. Explosions thundered one after another. Sprout saw the dark army waver, saw front ranks retreat, trying to avoid burns. We're holding them. Neville shouted, jumping to his feet. Professor, we're holding them. But Sprout saw otherwise. Saw new waves of Death Eaters emerging from the forest. Saw acromantulas going around the main path, crawling along rocks to the side, where there was no defense from plants. Saw how one of the giants, despite burns, continued forward, dragging the huge log. They're coming from the flank, someone shouted. Spiders! Sprout turned and saw them. Acromantulas crawling up the east wall, their huge bodies easily clinging to stone masonry. Another minute, and they'd be on the battlement. Protego tot alum, she shouted, directing her wand to the edge of the battlement. A golden shield flashed, but it was too weak, too small for such numbers of enemies. The first acromantula broke through it like a web and climbed onto the battlement. It was enormous, the size of a small house. 8 eyes glittered in darkness, pincers clicked, dripping venom. It moved its head, searching for prey, and its gaze stopped on Lavender Brown. The girl screamed, trying to retreat, but stumbled and fell. Stupefy! Sprout shouted, her spell hitting the acromantula in one of its eyes. The spider howled and turned toward her, but then Neville appeared between them. Incendio! He cried, and a stream of fire burst from his wand. The acromantula retreated, but fire only enraged it. It lunged forward, its pincers opening wide. Neville! Sprout screamed, but the boy didn't retreat. He stood firm, his wand moving so fast it drew fiery arcs in the air. Bombarda! He exclaimed. The explosion hit the acromantula in the head, throwing it back. It tumbled over the parapet, and with a terrible scraping sound fell down. Neville turned to Sprout, breathing heavily. His face was covered in soot, but his eyes burned with triumph. "I did it," he whispered. "Aye, look out!" Ginny cried. 2 more acromantulas climbed onto the battlement. Behind them, 3 more. They surrounded the students, their pincers clicking in anticipation of prey. "Tentacula!" Sprout shouted. "Neville, Ginny, Tentacula! Now!" They rushed to the pots with Venomous Tentacula. Sprout joined them, her wand creating a protective shield around her hands. "Locomotor!" they shouted together. Pots with Tentacula flew into the air. Sprout directed them not down to Death Eaters, but straight at the acromantulas on the battlement. The first pot smashed against the back of the nearest spider. Tentacula burst free, its tendrils immediately wrapping around the spider's body. The acromantula shrieked, trying to shake off the plant, but Tentacula had already found its vulnerable spots, joints between body segments, soft tissues around eyes. The second and third pots hit other spiders. Soon the battlement turned into a battlefield between plants and monsters. Tentacula strangled, acromantulas bit and clawed, green blood mixed with plant sap. "Retreat!" Sprout ordered the students. Away from them. They retreated to the center of the battlement, staying together. Sprout stood before them, her wand extended, ready to defend. One of the acromantulas, having torn off the tentacula, turned toward them. It was wounded, green blood flowing from a dozen wounds, but still dangerous. It raised its front legs, preparing to jump. Sprout didn't hesitate. "Defendo!" she shouted, and the severing charm cut through the spider's 2 front legs. The acromantula fell, its body collapsing onto stone. Sprout approached closer and finished it with another stupefy. Silence. For a moment, just a brief moment, silence reigned on the battlement. Students looked at her with a mixture of wonder and fear. She, Professor Sprout, peaceful gardener, had just killed an acromantula. "Professor," Hannah whispered, "you—" "I did what I had to," Sprout replied, her voice firm though her hands trembled. "Just as you will, if you must. This is war. We're defending ourselves." But suddenly she heard a cry, a real, human cry of pain. She turned and saw Dean Thomas. He lay by the parapet, his leg covered in blood. A spell, red, hot, had hit him when he was distracted by the spiders. "Dean!" Sprout rushed to him. The boy clutched his leg, his face contorted with pain. Blood flowed between his fingers, dark and too profuse. "Don't move," Sprout ordered, dropping to her knees beside him. "Don't move." Her hands automatically went to her pockets, pulling out a vial of Dittany. She poured the essence onto the wound, and Dean screamed even louder. Dittany burned as it healed. "Hold on," she whispered. "Just hold on." But even as she treated Dean, from the corner of her eye she saw that below the army was preparing for a new attack. Even more Death Eaters, even more monsters. And one of the giants, the one dragging the log, was already at the foot of the wall. "Professor," Neville whispered, approaching her. "The giant. He's—" "I see," she replied, not looking away from Dean. The giant raised the log. He was aiming at the wall, preparing to deliver a blow that could shatter stone. If he struck, the wall might fall. And behind it, the castle. Students. Everyone she loved. A choice. She had to make a choice. Treat Dean, or stop the giant. She couldn't do both. Sprout looked at Hannah. "Take the Dittany," she said, passing the vial to the girl. "Continue treating him. Pour evenly, not too much at once. Understand?" "Yes, but—" "Professor, what are you?" "I'm doing what I must," Sprout replied, rising. She approached the last crates, those containing Devil's Snare. The most dangerous plants of all she had. Plants that didn't just grab. They didn't let go until their victim stopped breathing. "Neville, Ginny," she called. "I need your help." They approached, their faces serious. "We'll take the Devil's Snare," Sprout said, "and drop it on the giant. But it will be dangerous. The snare can break free from control. If that happens—" "We're taking the risk," Neville interrupted. "We understand. But there's no choice, is there?" Sprout looked at him and saw in his eyes the same determination she felt herself. "No," she confirmed. "There's no choice." They opened the crates. Devil's Snare burst free, its long, sticky tendrils reaching in all directions. Sprout felt them trying to grab her, but her protective shield held. "Protego!" she shouted, strengthening the protection. "Neville, Ginny, do the same." They created protective shields, and together lifted the Devil's Snare using magic. The plants resisted. They wanted to strangle, to grab, but the three wizards were stronger. To the edge, Sprout ordered. Slowly, they carried the snare to the parapet. Below, the giant raised the log above his head, preparing to strike. One more second, and it would be too late. Now, Sprout screamed. Drop it! They released the devil's snare. The plants flew down, their tendrils opening wide, like wings of some terrible bird. They fell on the giant, on his head, shoulders, back, and immediately began wrapping around. Tendrils, each as thick as a human arm, coiled around the giant's neck, his arms, his body. They reached for his mouth, nose, eyes. The giant screamed, low, terribly, a sound that made blood freeze in veins. He dropped the log, which fell with a crash to the ground. His huge hands grabbed at the tendrils, trying to tear them off, but Devil's Snare never let go. Never. The giant swayed, took a step back, then another. His movements became slower, clumsier. He was falling to his knees, still trying to fight, but the snare strangled him, didn't let go. And then he fell. The impact was so strong that Sprout felt the battlement shudder beneath her feet. The giant didn't move anymore. Silence again descended on the battlement. Students looked down at the body of the enormous creature, covered in green tendrils of Devil's Snare. No one spoke. There were no words for what they had just witnessed. Sprout turned. Her students looked at her, some with wonder, some with fear. She saw how they looked at her hands, at her wand, as though not recognizing her. And she understood them. She didn't recognize herself either. The first wave is repelled, she said quietly. But this is only the beginning. They'll return, and we need to be ready. Neville approached her, his face serious. Professor, he said, you saved us. Saved the castle. Sprout shook her head. No, Neville. We saved it. Together. Not me alone. All of us. She turned to the battlement, looking at the battlefield below. Bodies of acromantulas, the giant Death Eaters. Her plants scattered among them. Mandrakes that no longer cried. Tentacula that still coiled. Devil's Snare that crawled across the ground. Such a price. Such a terrible price. But the castle stood. Students lived. And she would continue to fight as long as she had strength. How's Dean? She asked, turning to Hannah. The bleeding stopped, the girl replied, her voice trembling. He'll survive. Good, Sprout nodded. Take him to the hospital wing. Ernie, Justin, help. The rest with me. We need to prepare for the next attack. She looked east. The sky was beginning to lighten. The first rays of dawn touched the horizon. How much time had passed? An hour? 2. It seemed like an eternity. But the night wasn't over yet. The battle wasn't over yet. And Professor Pomona Sprout, gardener turned warrior, stood on the battlement of her castle, ready to meet what dawn would bring. Dawn came slowly, as though hesitating to touch the battlefield. The first rays of sunlight illuminated the battlement where Sprout stood with the group of students, all covered in soot, dirt, and blood, others in their own. They had repelled 2 waves of attacks. 2 terrible waves of Death Eaters, monsters, and curses. The plants that remained were damaged or exhausted. Mandrakes no longer screamed. Snargaluff had run out. Tentacula, those that survived, barely moved their tendrils. And Sprout knew they needed more. Much more. Professor, Ernie rasped, his voice hoarse from shouting spells. We've almost nothing left. What will we do? Sprout looked at him, then at the other students. Hannah held Susan, who could barely stand from exhaustion. Justin sat leaning against the parapet, his hands still trembling. Neville and Ginny stood together, supporting each other, their faces gray with fatigue. But they were still here, still alive, still capable of fighting. We're going to the greenhouses, Sprout said, her voice sounding firmer than she felt. We'll take more plants, as many as we can carry. But Professor, Hannah began, we're so tired. Maybe rest a bit. There will be no rest, Sprout interrupted, not harshly but decisively. Not while Voldemort is out there, beyond the walls. Not while our home is under threat. Come. Now. They descended from the battlement, passed through the castle. Everywhere were traces of battle. Collapsed walls, broken windows, blood on stone. In the corridors lay the wounded, being treated by Madame Pomfrey and her assistants. Sprout saw familiar faces among them, and her heart clenched with pain. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. When they emerged into fresh air, Sprout saw smoke rising from the hillside. She quickened her pace, feeling cold spread through her chest. No. Please no. But when they approached the greenhouses, reality struck her with such force she nearly fell. Greenhouse 3. Her favorite, her home, the place where she had spent thousands of hours, was destroyed. The glass wall shattered, the roof collapsed inward. Smoke drifted over the ruins, and inside she saw fire. Small fires smoldering among pots and earth. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She ran toward the ruins, ignoring the cries of students behind her. Her feet carried her through broken glass, through smoky haze, inside what had once been her sanctuary. Heat struck her face. The smell of burnt earth, charred leaves, incinerated life. Sprout looked at what remained of her plants, broken pots, blackened stems, roots sticking out of piles of ash. Years of work, decades of care, all destroyed by one curse. She fell to her knees among the ruins. Her hands, those same hands that had tended every plant here, now touched ash. Warm, still living ash. "Professor," she heard Neville's voice behind her. "Professor, you can't be here. It's dangerous." But Sprout couldn't leave, couldn't turn away from what had happened. Tears flowed down her cheeks, leaving clean trails on her soot-covered face. "I grew them," she whispered. "Each one. I knew every plant, every seed. And now they're all." "Not all," Luna's voice suddenly sounded. Sprout raised her head. The girl stood in another corner of the destroyed greenhouse, near the only wall that remained standing. She held something green in her hands. "Look," Luna said quietly. "Some survived." Sprout rose and approached her. And then she saw. In the corner, protected by part of the roof that hadn't fallen, stood several pots. They were sooty, cracked, but the plants in them, the plants lived. Young mandrakes, not yet mature but alive. Several stems of Devil's Snare, reaching toward light. One, only one, pot with a Venomous Tentacula which slowly moved its tendrils. "They survived," Sprout whispered, and in her voice was a mixture of wonder and hope. "They survived." She carefully lifted the pot with a mandrake. The plant was small, weak, but alive. Its roots gripped the earth firmly, refusing to give up. "Like us," Luna said quietly. "We survived too, and will continue surviving." Sprout looked at the girl, then at the other students who had gathered around. All were tired, wounded, frightened. But all stood. All continued. "Take what's left," she said, wiping away tears. "Carefully. These plants survived hell. They deserve our care." They began collecting what survived. It was so little compared to what had been. 10 pots instead of 30. But it was something. It was enough to continue. As they carried out the last pot, Sprout heard a sound. Distant but clear. A voice carrying over the battlefield. A voice that made blood freeze in veins. Voldemort's voice. "Stop," she ordered the students. "Listen." They froze, and in the silence heard the words. "You have had an hour to mourn your dead and tend your wounded. The time has passed. Harry Potter is dead, trying to flee from me. He ran to the forest to save himself, leaving you to die." Sprout felt the students beside her shudder. Hannah sobbed quietly, Justin swayed. "No, Neville whispered. It's not true. It can't be." But the voice continued, cold and self-assured. "Your defender is dead. Your hope is lost. Dumbledore is dead. Potter is dead. Surrender now, and I shall be merciful. Continue to resist, and every one of you will die. Every man, woman, and child who stands against me." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence that spread over the battlefield. "We've lost," Susan whispered. "If Harry's dead, we've lost." "No," Sprout said sharply. "No, we haven't lost. Not while we're breathing. Not while we stand. Come. To the castle. Now." They hurried back, carrying the plants. When they entered the castle, they saw everyone had gathered in the great hall. Professors, students, members of the Order of the Phoenix, all stood together, their faces gray with grief and exhaustion. Minerva McGonagall stood on the platform, her figure straight, but Sprout saw tears on her cheeks. "He demands we surrender," Minerva said, her voice trembling. "He says Harry is dead, that there's no more hope." "So what do we do?" someone asked from the crowd. Minerva straightened even more. "We go," she said firmly. "We go and look him in the eye, and we show him that we won't surrender. Never." Sprout pushed forward, standing beside Minerva. Phileas joined them, then Horace Slughorn, then other professors. One by one, a united front. "Together," Sprout said quietly. "We stand together." They left the castle. The whole school, what remained of it, emerged onto the steps before the main entrance. And there, on the field before them, stood the army of darkness. Even larger than before, even more terrifying. And at its head, Lord Voldemort, his pale face glowing with triumph. and beside him, in Hagrid's arms, a body. A small, lifeless body in torn clothing. Harry Potter. Sprout felt something break in her chest. No, it couldn't be. Not after everything they'd been through. Around her, students wept. Some fell to their knees. Despair spread among them like poison. But then Voldemort spoke again. "See," he said, spreading his arms. "Your hero is dead. Time to surrender." And then, from the crowd, Neville Longbottom stepped forward. Sprout saw him stride forward, his back straight, chin raised. He walked slowly but confidently, and each step was an act of defiance. "Neville," she whispered, "what are you doing?" Voldemort turned to the boy, and on his face appeared a smile, cold, contemptuous. "Well now," he said, "who have we here?" "Little Longbottom. Are you not the boy whose parents went mad from torture? Why not join me, Neville? I can make you strong." "I can. I'll never join you," Neville said loudly and clearly. His voice didn't tremble. "I'd rather die than stand on your side." Voldemort laughed, and his laughter was like the screech of broken glass. "Then die," he said simply. He raised his wand, and Neville froze. Sprout saw something dark, heavy descending onto the boy's head. The Sorting Hat. But it wasn't as before. It burned, flames bursting from it. Neville screamed, grabbed his head, trying to remove the hat, but it wouldn't come off. "No." Sprout lunged forward, but Minerva grabbed her hand. "Wait," McGonagall whispered. "Watch." Neville stopped screaming. His hands were still on the hat, but now he was pulling something from it. Something long, silver, that gleamed in the dawn light. A sword. Godric Gryffindor's sword. Neville tore off the burning hat and threw it aside, then raised the sword high above his head. The blade gleamed, reflecting the first rays of sun, and for a moment, just a brief moment, everyone froze, watching this picture. A boy who once feared everything now stood with the sword of the legendary Hogwarts founder, and on his face was no fear, only determination. Sprout felt tears come to her eyes, but these weren't tears of grief. These were tears of pride. "There he is," she whispered. "There's the real Neville, the one I always knew." Voldemort lost his smile. He raised his wand, preparing to kill Neville, but then, chaos. Everything happened at once. Centaurs burst from the forest, their arrows flying at Death Eaters. House elves flew from the castle, armed with knives and cleavers. And somewhere in the crowd someone screamed, "Harry Potter is alive!" Sprout turned and saw. Harry truly was alive. He stood among students, his wand extended, face determined. Battle erupted again. But now it was different. Now they had hope. "To positions!" Minerva shouted. "Everyone to positions!" Sprout didn't hesitate. She turned to the students standing behind her. "Plants!" she shouted. "Those we brought! Quickly!" They lifted the pots that had survived and carried them to the nearest positions. Sprout ran alongside, her wand moving continuously, creating protective shields, deflecting curses. Around her was chaos. Spells flew in all directions, red, green, blue light intersecting in the air. Screams, explosions, sounds of battle filled everything around. Sprout saw a Death Eater aiming at a group of younger students. She didn't think. "Stupefy!" she exclaimed, and her spell hit him in the chest. He fell, and she was already moving on, to the next enemy, to the next threat. She used everything she'd learned over years of teaching defensive magic in additional courses, everything she remembered from the First War. Stupefy, Petrificus Totalis, Protego, Bombarda. Spells poured from her wand, one after another. And the plants. Oh, the plants. She dropped the last Mandrake onto a group of Death Eaters. Its cry was weaker than before, but still sufficient to stun 3 enemies. She used the last Tentacula, dropping it on a Death Eater trying to break through to the hospital wing. Tendrils wrapped around him, and he was no longer a threat. She fought. Beside professors, beside students, beside everyone who loved Hogwarts. And she didn't retreat. And then suddenly a cry rang out, high, terrible, that made everyone stop. Sprout turned and saw Voldemort. He stood in the center of the field, his wand extended, and green light poured from it. But it wasn't flying forward. It was returning to him. And Harry Potter stood opposite him, his wand also extended, and red light met green in the air. Sprout held her breath. The whole world seemed to freeze, watching this battle. And then the green light faded. It returned to Voldemort and struck him in the chest. The Dark Lord opened his mouth, as though wanting to say something, but no sound came out. His eyes widened, his body shuddered. And then he fell, and didn't rise again. Silence. Absolute, complete silence. And then someone screamed, A cry of joy, relief, triumph. And the crowd erupted. Students embraced each other, professors wept, even centaurs raised their bows in salute. Voldemort was dead. The war was over. Sprout fell to her knees right where she stood. Her wand fell from weakened fingers. Her whole body trembled from exhaustion, from relief, from emotions that overwhelmed her. They survived. They all survived. Well, not all. She knew there were losses. Knew many good people had died this night. But the castle stood. Students lived. And now, finally, they could breathe freely. "Professor," she heard a voice. Neville dropped to his knees beside her. His face was covered with tears, but he smiled. "We did it. We really did it." Sprout looked at him, at this boy who had grown into a warrior before her eyes, and smiled through her own tears. "You did it, Neville," she whispered. "You were braver than all of us." He shook his head. "No. You taught me courage. You and all the others. You showed me that real strength isn't in magic. It's in roots, in what you believe, in readiness to defend that, whatever happens." Sprout embraced him, and he embraced her in response. They sat like that, in the middle of the battlefield, amid chaos and triumph, and simply held each other. The sun had already risen high above the horizon when Pomona Sprout was finally able to step away from the celebrations. Students still embraced, cried, laughed. Professors helped the wounded, counted the dead, began the long process of recovery. But Sprout had something to do, something that couldn't wait. She went to the greenhouses, to the ruins of what had once been her home. Greenhouse 3 still smoked. Sunlight broke through the shattered roof, illuminating ash and remains. Sprout entered inside, carefully stepping on broken glass. She approached the corner where she'd found the surviving plants. They were still there, their leaves reaching toward light. But now, in bright sunlight, she saw something else. There, among ash, among charred earth, a sprout was breaking through. A small, green sprout that hadn't existed yesterday. It had grown overnight, feeding on ash and rain that had fallen in the morning. It was so delicate, so fragile, that one wrong move could destroy it. But it was alive, and it was growing. Sprout dropped to her knees beside it. Her fingers, covered in earth and battle blood, carefully touched the soil around the sprout. She felt moist earth, felt how the sprout reached upward, seeking light. "You survived," she whispered. "Despite everything, you survived." Tears came to her eyes again, but this time she didn't hold them back. They flowed freely, fell onto the earth around the sprout, moistening it. "We all survived," she continued, speaking to the sprout, to the ruins, to herself. "And we'll rebuild. It will be hard. It will hurt. But we'll rebuild, just as you'll grow from this ash." She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Neville stood at the greenhouse entrance, his face tired but in his eyes burned quiet triumph. "Professor," he said quietly, "McGonagall is looking for you. Help is needed in the hospital wing. Your knowledge of herbs." Sprout nodded and rose. The work wasn't finished yet. The battle was won, but now another struggle began. The struggle for the lives of the wounded, for preserving what remained. She looked at the sprout one last time. "I'll return," she promised it. "I promise." And went back to the castle, to those who needed her help, to those still fighting for life. Because roots hold the tree, even when storm tries to fell it, even when everything around collapses. Roots hold, and Hogwarts had the strongest roots of all. The Hogwarts hospital wing had never been designed for such numbers of wounded. Beds stood pressed against each other, and even that wasn't enough. Students lay on camp beds in corridors, some simply on the floor, covered with blankets. The air was heavy with the smell of blood, potions, and pain. Pomona Sprout entered this chaos and immediately set to work. Madame Pomfrey rushed between beds, her face gray with fatigue. When she saw Sprout, relief flashed in her eyes. "Pomona," she whispered, "thank Merlin. I need your help. There's almost no Dittany left, and the wounded." "I'm here," Sprout said, rolling up her sleeves. "What should I do?" The next hours merged into one continuous stream of work. Sprout moved from bed to bed, cleaning wounds, applying compresses from herbs, mixing salves from what remained after the battle. Her hands, trembling with fatigue, still moved confidently. Years of experience guided her. Here was Colin Creevey, younger brother of the fallen Dennis. His leg was broken in 3 places, but he would walk. Sprout applied a poultice of comfrey root and yarrow to the fracture, which accelerated bone growth. There lay Parvati Patil, her face covered with burns from a curse. Sprout carefully applied a salve of aloe and Dittany, whispered soothing words whilst the girl cried from pain. And in the corner, On a separate bed lay Ernie Macmillan. Her Ernie, her faithful Hufflepuff. His chest was wrapped in bandages soaked with blood. A spell had hit him at the end of the battle when he was protecting a younger student. "Professor," he whispered when she approached. "I'm so tired." "I know, dear," she said gently, changing the bandages. "But you were so brave. So incredibly brave. I'm so proud of you." He tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace of pain. "Did we really win?" "Yes," Sprout confirmed, taking his hand in hers. "We really won." Tears rolled down his cheeks. "Then it was worth it," he whispered. "All the pain, it was worth it." Sprout sat with him, holding his hand, until he fell asleep. And only then did she allow herself to cry. Quietly, so as not to wake him, she wept for everything he had endured. For everything they had all endured. The third day after the battle, Sprout spent making a list. A list of those she had lost. Their names lay before her on parchment, written in her small, neat handwriting. Each name, this was a student she had known, whom she had taught, whom she had loved. Hufflepuff's losses were the smallest of all houses, but this didn't ease the pain. Devin Thompson, a second year with freckles on his nose, who always forgot protective gloves when working with Devil's Snare. Emily Jones, a fourth year who had dreamed of becoming a herbologist like Sprout. She had such a gift with plants, such understanding. Owen Cabot, a seventh year who was going to work in a magical plant shop on Diagon Alley after graduation. Now there would be no graduation. 3. Only 3 from Hufflepuff. But each was too many. Sprout sat in her room, holding the list, and cried. She cried for them, for their unfulfilled dreams, for parents who would have to bury their children. She cried for herself, for not being able to protect them. She was head of Hufflepuff. They were her responsibility, her family, and 3 of them would never come home again. Someone knocked on the door. Sprout quickly wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself. "Come in." The door opened and Hannah Abbott entered. In her hands was a basket with something that smelled of freshly baked bread. "Professor," she said quietly, "I brought you food. You haven't eaten all day." Sprout looked at the girl, at her pale face, at dark circles under her eyes, at hands that still trembled after the battle, and suddenly understood. Hannah had also lost friends. She too was suffering. But she came here to care for her professor. "Hannah," Sprout whispered, "you shouldn't have." "Yes, I should," the girl gently interrupted. "You always cared for us. Now it's our turn to care for you." She put the basket on the table and sat beside Sprout. Her gaze fell on the list of names, and she gasped quietly. "Devin," she whispered. I didn't even know. He always laughed. Always told silly jokes." "I know," Sprout said, feeling tears approach her throat again. They sat together in silence, mourning the fallen. Sometimes there are no words. Sometimes there is only pain that must be lived through together. The 4th day, rebuilding began. Sprout woke early, before dawn, and couldn't fall asleep again. Her body ached with fatigue, with bruises and scratches covering her, but she couldn't lie still. Couldn't just wait. She dressed and left the castle. The air was fresh, cool, morning fog spread over the ground. She walked to the greenhouses, to the ruins that had once been her home. Dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold as she reached Greenhouse 3. The ruins looked even worse in morning light, broken glass everywhere, collapsed walls, charred earth. But Sprout wasn't looking at the ruins. She was looking at what could be saved. She approached a pile of broken pots and began sorting through them. Her hands, wounded and aching, still worked. One by one she set aside what could still be used. Whole pots, undamaged tools, seeds that had survived. "Professor Sprout?" She turned. Behind her stood Neville, and behind him, Hannah, Susan, Ernie, who could barely stand but came anyway, Justin. Her Hufflepuffs. All of them. "What are you doing here?" she asked, surprised. "You should be resting." "We came to help," Ernie said, straightening up though it clearly caused him pain. "To rebuild." "But this will be hard," Sprout began. "It will take weeks, perhaps months." "Then we'll work for weeks and months," Susan said simply. "Professor, you gave us so much. You taught us, protected us, fought for us. Now let us give you something in return." Sprout looked at them, at these young people who had survived hell and still stood. Still wanted to help. Still had hope. "All right," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "All right, then let's begin." They worked all day, sorting through ruins, separating what could be saved from what had to be thrown away. It was slow, hard work, but they worked together, supporting each other. Others joined them. Ginny and Luna came after breakfast, carrying tools. Several younger Hufflepuffs came after lunch, their small hands helping to clear smaller debris. And gradually, step by step, the ruins began transforming into something else, into foundation for something new. At day's end, Sprout stood amid the partially cleared space and looked at her work. It was still far from a greenhouse, but it was a beginning. The first step. "Professor," a voice sounded behind her. She turned. Neville stood nearby, in his hands a pot with fresh earth. The same pot he had brought her on the day of battle, but which she hadn't taken then, running to the hospital wing. "I saved it," he said. "Thought now was the right time." Sprout took the pot. The earth in it was dark, fertile, full of life. "Thank you, Neville," she whispered. He smiled, but then his face became serious. "Professor, I wanted to tell you, after everything that happened, I've made a decision. Final." Sprout waited, giving him time to gather his thoughts. "I want to become a herbology professor," he said, his voice firm, confident. "Like you. I want to study plants, care for them, teach others. I want to continue what you started. If you'll teach me, of course." Sprout looked at him, at this boy who had grown into a man before her eyes, who had passed through hell and emerged stronger, who had held Gryffindor's sword and stood against Voldemort himself. And now he wanted to grow plants. "Neville Longbottom," she said, her voice trembling, "it would be my greatest honor, the greatest achievement of my life, to pass my knowledge to you." She approached him and embraced him. He embraced her in response, and they stood like that, among ruins and hope, teacher and student, gardener and future gardener. "I'll teach you everything," she whispered. "Every secret, every technique. And when the time comes, you'll be a better professor than I ever was." "No," he quietly objected. "I'll simply continue what you started. Your roots." They stepped apart, and Sprout smiled through tears. "Then let's begin now," she said. First lesson, how to transplant a sprout that grew among ash. A week after the battle, the castle slowly came to life. The wounded recovered. Students returned to classes, those classes that could still be held. Professors tried to create semblance of normality amid chaos. But there was no normality yet, and perhaps there never would be the same as before. Sprout spent most days in the greenhouses, or what remained of them. Greenhouse 1 was least damaged, and there she focused her efforts. She rebuilt, transplanted, healed surviving plants. Work helped. When hands were busy, mind didn't wander to dark places. When she cared for plants, she felt connection to something greater than pain and loss. One evening, as the sun was already setting beyond the horizon, Minerva McGonagall came to her. The new headmistress of Hogwarts looked every one of her years, perhaps even older, but in her eyes still burned that same unbreakable fire. "Pomona," she said, entering the greenhouse. "I wanted to talk to you." Sprout put down her gardening tool and wiped her hands on her apron. "Of course, Minerva. What happened?" McGonagall came closer, her gaze sliding over the restored greenhouse. "The Board of Governors wants the school to reopen in September. Fully. They say children need stability, normality." "And what do you think?" Sprout asked. Minerva sighed. "I think they're right. Children truly need it. But..." She fell silent, looking out the window at the ruins of Greenhouse 3. "Are we ready? Is the castle ready? Are we ourselves ready?" Sprout approached her and stood beside her. "We'll never be completely ready," she said quietly. "Scars will remain. Memory of what happened will never disappear. But life continues, Minerva. Just as plants grow after fire, we grow after war. You always find hope in darkest places," Minerva said quietly. "I envy you that." "It's not hope," Sprout replied. "It's knowledge. Knowledge of how life works. It doesn't stop because of pain. It grows through it. And we can too." Minerva nodded, and for a moment they stood in silence, two tired women who had endured too much. "Do me a favor," Minerva finally said. "Rebuild your greenhouses. Make them even more beautiful than they were. Show students that after destruction always comes rebirth." "I'll do it," Sprout promised. "I promise." 3 weeks after the battle, the morning was clear, sunny. The sky was cloudless, and birds sang in the forbidden forest. It seemed impossible that just 3 weeks ago the most terrible battle the magical world had known unfolded here. Sprout stood at the entrance to Greenhouse 1. It was fully restored now, new glass and frames, repaired roof, fresh earth and beds. Surviving plants had been transplanted here, and they were already beginning to revive, feeling care and attention. But today Sprout hadn't come here. She went to the ruins of Greenhouse 3, the place where everything began, where everything almost ended. where she had found the sprout among ash. Over these 3 weeks, they had cleared most of the ruins. Broken glass was removed, charred earth dug up and replaced with fresh. The frame of a new greenhouse already stood, wooden beams waiting for glass. Another week, maybe 2, and Greenhouse 3 would again be ready to receive plants. But now, right in the center of the future greenhouse, on a small cleared patch of earth, stood one pot. The pot Neville had brought her, and in it the sprout. It had grown over these 3 weeks. Now it was not just a small green shoot, but a real young plant with a strong stem and several leaves. Sprout wasn't sure what species it was. The sprout had grown from seeds that fell into ash, possibly from several species at once. But it was beautiful, alive, strong, a symbol of rebirth. Sprout dropped to her knees beside the pot. In her hands was another pot, larger, filled with the best earth she could find. A mixture of compost, humus, magical fertilizer. Everything best for this little plant that had survived the impossible. "Well then," she whispered, carefully lifting the small pot. "Time to move to a new home. A bigger home, where you can grow even stronger." She carefully extracted the sprout along with the clump of earth around the roots. The root was longer than she expected. It had gone deep into earth, seeking nutrients, water, life. A strong root, a root that would hold. Sprout made a depression in the new pot and carefully placed the sprout there. Then covered it with earth, pressing around the root, but not too tightly. Plants need space to breathe, to grow. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at her work. The sprout stood in the new pot, its leaves reaching toward the sun breaking through the open roof of the future greenhouse. "Professor?" She turned. Neville stood at the entrance, and behind him was a whole group of students. Anna, Susan, Ernie, Justin, Ginny, Luna. A few more faces she recognized from lessons. They all carried something, pots with plants, bags of seeds, gardening tools. "We thought," Neville said, "that the sprout shouldn't be alone, that it needs company." Sprout looked at them, and her heart overflowed with emotions. They had brought plants, their own plants, grown in rooms, tended during these difficult weeks. And now they wanted to plant them here, in the new greenhouse, together with the sprout of hope. Her voice broke, and she couldn't continue. Hannah approached first. In her hands was a small pot with a young rose, a delicate pink flower swaying in the wind. "This is from me," she said quietly. "A rose. It has thorns, but it's beautiful. Like all of us, wounded, but still able to bloom." She placed the pot beside the sprout. Ernie was next. He still moved carefully, protecting his chest, but carried a large pot with something green and bushy. "Rosemary," he said, "for remembrance, so we never forget those who fell, but also for strength, because we're stronger than we thought." Susan brought lavender, Justin basil, Luna something strange and beautiful that she said was called moonflower and bloomed only at night. One by one they placed their pots, creating a small garden in the midst of ruins. A garden of hope, a garden of memory, a garden of future. When all pots were arranged, Sprout stood in the center, surrounded by students and plants. The sun shone through the open roof, golden and warm. Birds sang somewhere nearby. Wind gently swayed the leaves. And in this moment Pomona Sprout understood something important. The war was over. Battles won. But the work, the real work, was only beginning. The work of rebuilding. The work of healing. The work of growing new life from ash of the old. And this work would never end. Because gardening isn't about the end. It's about the process. About daily care, daily labor, daily waiting whilst seed sprouts, whilst shoot grows, whilst flower opens. Hogwarts was like a garden. It needed care, attention, love. And whilst there were people ready to give this, professors, students, everyone who loved this castle, it would grow. It would flourish. "Professor," Neville said quietly, "what now?" Sprout looked at him, then at the other students, then at the small garden they had created together. "Now," she said, and in her voice was confidence she hadn't felt for many weeks. "Now we do what we've always done. We tend. We grow. We wait. And we believe that life will find a way." She dropped to her knees and began loosening earth around the sprout. Neville joined her, then Hannah, then others. And so they worked together, in the silence of dawn, amid ruins and hope. Their hands were in earth, their faces turned toward sun. They planted, tended, loved. Because this was their strength. Not in magic, not in spells, not in duels. In roots, in loyalty, in readiness to defend what you believe. In understanding that after darkest night always comes dawn. in knowledge that life continues, and in hands ready to grow it. Many years later, when Neville Longbottom became professor of herbology at Hogwarts, he often brought his students to Greenhouse 3. It was the most beautiful of all greenhouses, full of rare plants, exotic flowers, magical trees. But in its very center, in a place of honor, grew one tree that always attracted attention. No one knew exactly what species it was. It had leaves like an oak, but flowers like a magnolia. The bark was silvery, and roots went so deep into earth it seemed to hold the entire greenhouse. Students always asked about it, and Neville always told the same story. The story of a sprout that grew among ash. The story of a professor who believed in the power of roots. The story of how life always finds a way, even in darkest times. And he told them what Professor Sprout said to him that day when they planted the tree together. Roots don't need light to grow. They grow in darkness, deep underground, and that's what makes them strong. And when storm comes, when wind tries to fell the tree, roots hold it. Always hold. Pomona Sprout retired 10 years after the battle. But her legacy remained. In greenhouses she rebuilt, in students she taught, in trees and plants she grew. And most of all, in understanding that real strength isn't in magic. It's in roots, in loyalty, in love, in readiness to defend your home, whatever happens, in knowledge that after war always comes peace. And that life, beautiful, unbreakable life, always finds a way. Always.